That'll kind of work. Well, it's 12 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started. You guys ready? All right. Good afternoon, just barely, everybody. My name is Joey Lost Knowledge. The talk is Finding Your Balance. Kind of about finding your work-life balance and what that's all about. So, I guess first off, why am I doing this talk? There was a conversation I had about, it should say on there, June 16th, so about 3 months ago, with Totenkopf on Twitter, about, she felt like there wasn't such a thing as work-life balance, that it didn't exist. And I kind of disagreed with her because I feel like I've managed to find that. And so, that's kind of why I wanted to give this presentation, because, I felt like, there were other people who also didn't think, it existed. And so I wanted to try to share some of my background and history with folks so that they could hopefully find it a little faster than it took me. I'm about 10 plus years into my security career before I found a situation that I thought was properly balanced. So, a little about my background. I grew up in Kentucky. I went to school at Ohio State. And then I spent 10 years living in Northern Virginia in the D.C. metro area, which, from a low-stress perspective, is one of the last places in the world you probably ever want to live. It is significantly more stressful in my mind than probably even some other large cities. And I think in part because of how sprawling the metropolis area is. Just a little bit more background. This will be a little bit more work-related. So, when I got out of school, the first thing I wound up doing was working at the U.S. Patent Office, which was probably one of the most boring jobs I've ever had. It was my first job out of school. It was good in the sense that, I had a pretty set schedule. When I was in the office, I was working. When I wasn't in the office, I wasn't working. But it was a pretty bad commute. It had the benefit of being mostly via public transit, so I didn't have to necessarily, pay attention to what I was doing. But it was still a very boring job. And, having just been moved out there, it was very isolating, right? So you go someplace where you don't know anybody and you spend 8+ hours a day working, tack on 2 hours a day commuting, you have a lot less time to actually, do things. So I left there after about 8 months or so and started working for a company called Atlan, which was a small FIPS validation company. It was my first real security job. Again, working 40-hour weeks, my commute went from being an hour. It was probably about the same. Early on, it may have even been a little closer to 40 minutes. But it was a far more interesting job, and and as such, kind of kept me more motivated. And it also helped that it was a much smaller company, right? So being in a new area and not knowing a lot of people, it was good to be with a company that actually kind of had a small company feel and had a kind of family atmosphere, because people wanted to spend time with each other outside of the office. And so that was, that was a big boost, as well, kind of in me staying out there. So about 3 years into working there, they got bought by SAIC. And not solely to SAIC's fault, things started changing a lot. Some of the atmosphere things obviously changed, but at the same time in that period, I took on more managerial duties. I started doing more project management, people management, all the fun things that tech people don't want to do, especially when they're young. And working 60+ hour work weeks. So it was a real drain on me. I was traveling a lot, And that kind of, took me to my next step. And I knew I wanted to get back to a smaller company. And so that's what I wound up doing. I went back to a small company in Tenacity that was doing government contract work. This was the first time I really got into pen testing, which is what I'm still doing today. Again, it was a small atmosphere, a little bigger than Atlin. Atlin, I think at its peak was 12 or 15 people. Tenacity at its peak was about 100, 150. But it was still a very, very small atmosphere. We still did monthly get-togethers where we were drinking and having a good time. They used to do annual off-sites where we would all go. One year we all went up to New York City and, basically a giant party for a weekend. As with my last small company experience, that ended. This one's significantly more painfully in my mind. And again, large company kind of killed the atmosphere, but it also, unlike the first acquisition, it killed a lot of benefits. And really, while my work remained the same and what I was doing wasn't any different, it was, in that situation, it was a lot of it was who I was working for that was more my problem than what I was doing. And I'll kind of get into some of that stuff later. So that leads me up to modern history, or I guess present day. So now I got out of DC. I moved to Tennessee. I work for, I will say, an average to large size company, but the benefit is we have a small security team and they still have a pretty small company atmosphere. And I have work I love to do. I'm in a place that I enjoy far more. And so because of that, I'm a much happier individual, relatively speaking. So now that I've gone through all that spiel, what is work-life balance? So, I think there's kind of two ways to look at it, right? A lot of people consider, trying to find that balance between your work life, your personal life. For me, I feel like it's a lot of trying to balance those things, but also balance the stress, right? There's a lot of stress that comes associated with both work and with both our personal lives. And so trying to find ways to balance that so that, so that life in general is a more enjoyable experience. I threw together some raw numbers because I was sitting around and, trying to figure out, is there a way to just like quantify it? And I mean, you can see there's how much of our time we spend at work, I do think comes into play. I'd like to think most people aren't putting in 20, 80 or more hours a year for work. I'd like to think you're working less. And government contracts, that was the one nice thing about government contracting work. Most government contracts capped the number of hours that a company could bill, which meant it was really hard for you to work more than 1860. You got to 1860 hours, you were done. Like, they couldn't put you on a contract anymore. They couldn't bill you to the contract anymore without approvals. And so that was one nice thing about that, right? Because I knew at the end of the day that 1860 works out to roughly about 3-4 weeks of leave plus 10 with the 10 federal holidays. So, that's probably a more reasonable number for what I try to keep targeted as far as how much I want to work. And I think that's a big part of it. Even if you love your job, it's still work. I love my current job, but it's still my job, and there's still things I like to do that aren't related to my job, and I like to have as much time as possible to do those. So like I said, there's a lot of stress in our lives, right? There's stress from both work and, and our personal lives. But the thing to remember about stress is that it can take a big toll on us, right? Both physically and mentally. Having gone through that, in the past, for me, the physical part, was probably not as bad as the mental. I'm sure I probably had slightly higher blood pressure and and stuff like that from a physical perspective. But for me, it was a lot more mental. It was very draining, being in the stressful environments I was in. And so, it impacted kind of my desire to do other things. Normally when we had, what free time we did have, I wanted to spend doing very specific things and wasn't as keen on going and doing other things I might not have been inclined to do, including going and hang out with friends and stuff like that. I would rather have spent more time kind of doing stuff around our house, doing some of the other things that I enjoyed doing. So it kind of was also a little isolating in and of itself. So, there's the quote, there's many variations on it, find something you enjoy doing and, you never work a day in your life. It's only a partially true statement. Don't get me wrong. If you're in a job you hate, you're going to be miserable. There's nothing I can do about that or you can do about that. If you're in a job you really enjoy, though, it does make a big difference. And so having a job you enjoy is important, but, there's a lot of other factors that come into that. Even though there's work that you may enjoy and might like doing, the people you're working with, who you're working for, can obviously have a pretty big impact on all that. There's just the normal life stresses. The reality is, we have stress that comes along with having friends, with having family. They can be both our friends and families can both be benefits and sometimes hindrances. But it's all about, looking at how those things impact you and what they're doing. So I guess that takes me kind of to how do you find your balance? So, excuse me. So really, when you're trying to find your balance, what you need to be looking at, is trying to find ways to minimize that stress and also looking at ways to get the maximum enjoyment out of what time you do have, what your free time is. And so, for me, it's about a big part of it is, trying to find what your priorities are from both a work and a life perspective, right? So, when you go to find your work priorities, you want to find a job, you might have, pay maybe a consideration, the work you're doing, benefits and stuff like that. But, you want a job you enjoy, right? And, you have to imagine Usain Bolt enjoys his job, right? I mean, the man can run a race and be smiling at, the camera while beating everybody. But it's very much trying to identify what's important for you, right? So what do you want out of a job? For me, that was, a lot of it was where I was working, what I was doing. And that was a big reason why I left the DC area. For me, that environment alone was a big stressor. And I knew what kind of work I liked to do. I knew what I wanted, and I wanted a company that, supported my ability to come to events like this and wasn't going to be a hindrance to me attending conferences, speaking at conferences. So those are all things I considered when I was looking. And so I think that's, when you go and you're looking at, how do I find that balance? If there's things in your current job or in your current life situation that make that difficult, then looking at these priorities and saying, what are the most important items is the beginning of trying to, move into a situation where you're going to have a better balance. You need to find your personal priorities. It's going to vary from person to person, right? A single guy who doesn't have, a family is going to have much different priorities than a guy who's married and has 3 kids at home, right? The guy with kids is more than likely going to want to spend a lot more time with his kids and be there for his kids growing up. The single guy, probably wants to have more time for friends, more time for hanging out, whatever debauchery single men do nowadays. So, for me, finding my priorities was really, first was more free time, right? That meant more time for me to do things I enjoy, playing with my Legos, playing with my Xbox, working on Arduino projects, doing, I still do security research in my free time. And I think that was one of the things that that Totenkopf brought up in our conversation on Twitter was, that she felt like the work-life balance wasn't possible because a lot of us spend free time doing research and security and stuff like that. And I think what kind of bothered me about that statement is if you feel like your hobby is a job or a part of your job, then it's not a hobby anymore. There's a clear delineation between what I do for security research and what I do in my day-to-day. Some of what I do in my, in research may wind up overlapping with my work, but I don't let it define me. And if I get tired of, if the research I'm doing becomes too intertwined with my work, then, I just need to move on to something else. I don't let those things, I try to keep those things very distinct and separate. And so in that regards, even though I work in security, I'm a pen tester. For me to go do research on other things, in my mind, takes me, a lot of times I'm going and looking at stuff in security kind of outside of my normal realm of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. So I try very hard to separate those. And that's one of the things, I feel like, since we do have that overlap a lot of times, that some people do, feel like it's just going from work into their personal lives. I wanted more times with friends, going to conferences, hanging out with everybody. I always enjoy coming, getting to see people, being able, I mentioned before, not wanting to necessarily go out, last week, going out with friends who came down into Nashville and hanging out, like a year and a half, 2 years ago when I was living in DC, I would have had very little motivation to want to go out and go do that, just because of the situation. So that's been a big part of the change for me, right? So some people are going to ask, aren't you an angry guy? And I gave a Twitter example. I do tweet a lot. I do vent a lot on Twitter. I do swear a lot. The fact I've gotten this far in this presentation without a significant swear word is pretty impressive. I use, on a daily basis, I use all 7 of George Carlin's dirty words. Yes, I'm very angry, but in my mind, those angry statements and that, for me, is a lot of release, and it's not letting it all be pent up, right? Leaving stuff be pent up can create more problems, right? And I feel like that's what, before, and there was a period where I let a lot of those things build up, and they inevitably ended in very violent eruptions of anger and rage, which weren't pleasant to be around and weren't necessarily good for me physically, because I sometimes hurt myself when I punch things. Not people, things. So I found that letting those little things and just getting shit out of the way when it happens has helped me a lot. It reminds me a lot of, there's an old scene from Family Guy where, Brian looks at Lois and says, basically says, don't you stop and think, geez, sometimes, God, I'm married to that guy. And she goes, no, I just repress it. And Brian goes, is that healthy? And then there's like a Peter's voice singing as I'm a tumor in her brain. It's those sorts of things. Like, I try not to let the stress and those things build up, because, it just feels like when you let those things build up, they lead to either more stress down the line or, more health issues down the line. So like I said, yes, I can come off pretty angry, but, it's all relative. At least when dealing with me. So I know I've kind of thrown a lot of information about what I've done and some of the things I've done in finding, work-life balance. And so I intentionally tried to leave a lot of time in here for questions, because I figured that there would probably be some, and also, to kind of expand on any of the topics I discussed if anybody, wanted to. So, does anybody have any questions? Nobody? Is it going to be a silent room? Jeez, guys. Hold on. Nope, nobody. Okay. Sorry, I logged into the live stream so people in the live stream could ask me questions too. Yes, sir.
So do you find that in transitioning between the different roles and different jobs, do you find that it diminishes your personal interest in the field?
No, I mean, one of the things for me, especially when I've been doing jobs, is one of the inevitable downfalls to most places I've worked is I get bored in my job. One of the reasons that the job at one of my first jobs, which I know for a lot of people in security probably sounds boring as heck, right? You're doing, validations and you're doing assessments and going through check boxes, to test products. But for me, part of the reason that was a very interesting job and why I stayed in it for 6 years was the, variance in what I saw. So 1 week we would be doing, assessments with network devices. The next week it would be software. 1 week you may be doing smart cards. The next week you may be doing hardware security modules. And so doing those different things, working on those different projects, I was still doing a lot. A big part of that was also code review. And for me, part of it was I got to see a lot of code that, outside of the organizations that we were working with, people didn't see a lot of that code. So it was kind of cool to be able to do a lot of that, and actually was where I really started to learn. And I got a lot of information about cryptography then. So I would say I probably have more than most average persons, but I'm nowhere near like a cryptographer level. But it was very much an interesting time to kind of learn and expand. Whereas my last pen testing job, I enjoyed it a lot, but it felt, because of the process and the methods that we used in that organization, it felt very repetitive. It felt like we were doing the same things over and over, in part because we were probably finding the same things over and over within our networks. So far, I've not seen that issue in my current job. Doing internal pen testing, you might think, oh God, it could get boring really quick. The current company I work for has a very big network. We have lots of applications, and so far it's been very interesting kind of doing one thing to another, and I'm still learning stuff. So, I don't worry as much about it as I did in my last job, where it felt like everybody on the team had a very specific role and nobody went outside of their little scope of their role. Excuse me. So, that's been a big part of it for me. So, yeah. Yeah, sure.
So a lot of lip service has been given to a board.
Right.
But have any of those helped you to figure out where you prefer to go role-wise that leads towards what you might consider a period of fulfillment?
So, for me, somewhat over time, and I kind of decided this, I think, sometime during my last job. I know that I eventually am going to lead down to a path of management. I've done it twice in my career now, and I've honestly enjoyed it. Helping to develop new people, helping them kind of grow from entry level folks and become more senior talent over time was actually a very fulfilling process for me. So I know that's something I'm kind of working towards. And that's another part of the reason why I took the job that I'm in now, is because, right now we're a team of one on pen testing, but there was, knowledge when I interviewed that, we would be growing the team and that I'd basically have a lot of input in how that team gets built. And so because of that, I'm basically, that was a big reason for taking my current job, was that I wanted to be able to find people that I wanted to work with and be able to help them grow and develop the skills and become pen testers. And if, they work for us, in the future, if they work for us for a year or two and move on to, even bigger and better things, great. I want people, I like to see people, succeed. At least the ones who seek the help and want to learn. And so for me, that's been a big part of kind of where I feel like my future in the field is. Yeah.
What are your thoughts when people say you should switch jobs or switch companies every 5 years? Maybe you said if you're in a consulting firm to the defense contractors, would you say that switching contracts maybe an approach like that if you like the company you're at?
Right. I think so, right? Like if you were working for one company and going from one contract to another, I feel like that nobody could fault you if of like trying to be stagnant. I definitely think where people talk about moving from one company to another or one job to another, I sometimes feel is an overrated statement, and it looks at a very narrow scope of it, right? Some people, I've met people who are older than me who are perfectly content being seniors and lead developers or testers, and they don't want any part to do with management. They don't like dealing with it. They don't like dealing with, the things associated with it, especially if they have to do the HR side of things. And so they're good at what they do, and they're going to keep doing it. I feel like everyone needs to look at their own situation, and I try not to get hung up on these like theories and beliefs that everybody has about what is and isn't acceptable for helping somebody in their career. So I'd like to take more questions, but I'm kind of up against the time. So I will put up my contact information. If anybody does have any other questions or wants to talk about, how you find a work-life balance, you can find me on Twitter. You can hit me up on email. I'm here all weekend, including through Sunday. So, find me. We can get a drink. We can talk about, we can talk about it, if you want to talk about your specific situation or just, ask generic questions. Find me around. So, thank you, everybody.